Just to make sure you're in the right place, this is Trauma in the Workplace, Creating Healthier Workplaces. And again, it's with Dr. Anoop Sharma, Mark Feinberg, and myself. A little disclaimer is that this is not this is not content to be taken as any type of educational, or I'm sorry, medical, legal, or financial or spiritual advice. And it's for learning purposes only, educational purposes only. So this is not a substitute for any professional mental health advice. If you do find that the conversation today stirs up some big emotions in with you, it's totally normal. And I always encourage people to either journal or talk to a friend about it. And just be aware that today's conversation does center around trauma in the workplace as well as childhood trauma. And so if this is your first time learning about it, or, attending an event like this, just be aware that sometimes some big emotions might come up afterwards or in the next couple of days. And you might want to talk to somebody or use some of your coping skills to manage your emotions. If you're in a crisis, you can always contact the National Crisis Hotline, which is 988. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and is free and immediate help for any mental health problems. I'm going to ask Mark and Anoop to keep a little bit of an eye on the waiting room and admit people just as I'm going through these slides, and then we'll get started. So in case you don't know who I am Beth Tyson, and I am the owner of Beth Tyson Trauma Consulting. I've teamed up with Anoop and Mark today to talk about workplace trauma. And this is a conversation that is new to a lot of people. We know we talk about trauma-informed care, but it often doesn't cross over into the corporate realm. It's usually in educational settings or hospital settings and medical care and things like that. But we don't often talk about how it impacts people in their workplace, in their offices, and in corporate America. So we will be going there today with a very open and vulnerable conversation with Mark and Anoop and their experiences as leaders in their field, and also coping with trauma and experiencing workplace trauma. Mark and Anoop, are you able to admit people from your participant window when people are trying to get in?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So that's a little bit about me. I think most of you know who I am. I have a lot of my LinkedIn family here, so I'm sure you've seen some of my posts and what I'm all about. Today, we will go through some introductions of Mark and Anoop so that you can get familiar with them. They may be new names to you, but I promise you this is going to be worth your time. And then we'll talk about the workplace trauma. They'll give us some examples as leaders, what it has been like for them, and some things that have worked and haven't worked over the years. And then at the end, if there's time, hopefully, because we could talk about this stuff literally all day long, we will go and have a little Q&A chat with you all. And at the very end, when you hit end meeting, a survey will pop up asking you 4 very simple questions. And if you could answer those survey questions for us, it would be immensely helpful for the direction that we want to take this conversation moving forward. So we have some exciting things on our horizon around this topic, and we can't wait to share it with you guys. So stay on to the end for all of that. All right. If you want to get in touch with any of us, I'm directing everyone to just email me or go to my website, bethtyson.com, and hit the contact. So if anytime throughout this presentation or even afterwards, if you have questions, if you are interested in meeting with us to discuss or explore opportunities, you can contact me and I will route those requests to Mark and Anoop. So, all right, without further ado, we're going to get right into it. All right, we're starting off just talking a little bit about what trauma actually is. But before we do that, Mark is going to lead us in a very short breathing exercise just to kind of get us all present and here and try and clear our minds from what was happening maybe 5 or 10 minutes ago and be fully present here in this moment. If that is uncomfortable for you in any way, feel free to not participate. I know that sometimes breathing for some folks can activate feelings of trauma. And so if that's not your desire today and you don't want to do that, maybe you know, shake out your limbs or, you know, get up and bend down and touch your toes or something different. But don't feel that you have to do the breathing exercise. It's just an offer. So I'll let Mark take the lead.
Thank you, Beth.
You're welcome.
Hello, everybody. Good to be here. So as Beth said, breathing intentionally, mindfully helps to calm down the body. So we'll start with a deep breath in through the nose for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, and then let go for 4 seconds. So breathe in through the nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Deep breath out. 1, 2, 3, 4. And let the body relax. Breathe in through the nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. And release through the mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. In through the nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. And out. 1, 2, 3, 4. Relax your body. Relax into your chair, or your couch, wherever you might be. Namaste.
Thank you, Mark. That was beautiful. I really appreciate that. It's just a nice way to all come together in the same place and settle our nervous systems, because that's what we'll be talking about today. So we're going to start off, and I apologize, I have a cough drop in. My throat's been a little scratchy this week. We're going to start off discussing what is trauma, just a high level overview of what is trauma and how it shows up in the workplace. So, Anoop, I'd love to hear your perspective and how you define trauma.
So for many of us, especially in medicine, whenever anybody says trauma, we always think of a traumatic event, more likely a car accident or something that occurred that has bodily injury. So that's what we tend to look at. Now, in medicine, we also have psychological trauma where we think of soldiers, where they've suffered a great event, but it occurred during war. So that's the way many of us kind of have experienced it in healthcare. But as we discuss more today, we'll probably see more things related to the trauma that we may all be experiencing. So just wanted to give that short view.
Thank you for that. And while I'm thinking of it, I did not ask you to introduce yourself. So if you could also add on a little introduction just to tell us who you are and why you're here today.
Sure. By training, I'm family medicine, internal medicine trained, practice as a hospitalist and more on the acute side of healthcare. Did actually transition to what I call value-based world, aka insurance, commercial, Medicare Advantage, all those spaces, but also serve as a mentor, coach, and my favorite job, father of 3 lovely ladies.
Wow. Clapping for that. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us. Mark, how about you? Can you give us a short introduction and tell us why you're here today?
Yeah, so my shirt gives a little bit of it away. I'm a multi-time founder, entrepreneur. Started and sold a few, and started and failed a few, and also a coach, and currently a co-founder for an amazing company, Lucero, which provides a set of digital mental health and resilience tools for kids and families. And I am a single dad to a 15-year-old boy who's my pride and joy. So,
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning that, because that's how we met, right? We all met around childhood trauma and the work that Mark is doing at Lucero. And we came together and said, hey, we really need to have a public conversation about workplace trauma. And so that's how the three of us ended up here today. Thank you for that introduction. So we heard a little bit from Anoop about what he thinks or how he defines trauma. And for me, I define trauma as any event or experience that happens and your response to it. So it's not necessarily the event, but it's the internal response of your nervous system to the event. And so the most important thing to remember about trauma as we discuss it today is that it's subjective, meaning that not everybody will experience trauma the same way, as well as one thing may traumatize one person or be traumatic for one person and not be traumatic for another. So two people could experience the same exact accident or emotional abuse or traumatic loss, and some would have symptoms of PTSD and then others might not. And it's on a spectrum too. So, PTSD is at the far end where it's full blown, all the symptoms are diagnosable. And then you could have a trauma reaction, which means you just have some of the reactions of PTSD, but not all of them. And so then you would not necessarily have a PTSD diagnosis, but you still have experienced trauma within your nervous system. And what's important to note is that we bring all of these things from childhood on up to even just, the world we're living in right now. These are all, potential traumatizing events that impact all of us. And we don't leave those things at home when we go to work every day. We bring them with us. And then we have trauma that's actually happening in the workplace, and you bring that trauma home with you. So you're taking it both directions. And it's important that we talk about it and just see, like, how can we be more supportive to one another? How can we create more workplaces that understand trauma and can become healing places instead of hurting places? You think I covered it?
yes, perfect.
Great. Okay, so back to my questions. I'm wondering, whoever wants to go first can, just pipe up. But how has trauma impacted you as a leader?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I grew up a musician, and that was sort of, who I was in middle school and high school, and yet performance for me was the scariest thing in the world. Being on stage, being in front of people, the amount of anxiety that I had that lived inside my body was crippling in a lot of ways. And fast forward to life works in funny ways. I end up the CEO of multiple companies. And what does being CEO of multiple companies mean? You're in front of people all the time. And all of the trauma from performing and being in front of people would manifest or would come back. I'd have all the anxiety. I didn't have all the tools to know how to deal with it necessarily. And the fear of people and the fear of, performing was such that, it would manifest in a lot of control of people who work with me and, for me. It was so uncomfortable for me to be in those roles that control was the best way for me to feel better. And, being controlled is never a good feeling. And it would manifest in trauma of other people. So my trauma became their trauma, or, and, that's something that, I continue to work on. I'm certainly better, but it's constant in terms of managing the anxiety, managing, I'm here today. My nervous system is pretty good, but like, there's still a lot of, I know there's still a lot of eyes there, right? But like, that's just been an evolution of, what is anxiety? You don't feel safe, right? Like you're scared, right? Like whoever came up with the analogy at some point, not everything is a lion is going to eat you. Like I had to learn that not everything is a lion, right? And I'm still, there's still things that pop up that my nervous system reacts and like it thinks it's a lion, and then I have to have a conversation with myself. Like there's no lion, you're safe, everything's fine. The people looking at you, they're not all gonna eat you. Like, so, that constant work on myself. And I'm not alone in that. A lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of people, right? Like we're there's, it's scary, right? It can be. So, learning that about myself and why I was leading the way I was, a lot of fear, a lot of control, that was my own stuff. So, I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing that with us and being open. I know what you mean when you say everything can look like a lion, when you're feeling anxious, and that's our brain trying to protect us from harm, or perceived harm, but sometimes it overreacts, right? We have this overreactive portion of our brain that tells us everything is to be feared when we've experienced childhood trauma or other types of trauma throughout our life. And so we become hypersensitized and hyper aroused in our nervous system to be on the lookout for threats and to also sometimes accidentally perceive threats that aren't even there, which can cause a lot of trouble in the workplace, right? You might see a facial expression from your supervisor or a colleague or employee and think, oh my gosh, this person is angry at me. And you might read into that more to think, oh, maybe they're going to fire me, or maybe they're going to report me to HR, or you might come up with all these things because your brain is so used to being on high alert from the harm that you may have endured as a child, in your relationships with your parents or through other abusive type relationships throughout your life, maybe even with a partner or loved one. So I think that's a great example of, why we need to talk about this. It's not something that any of us can escape from. We all, in my opinion, we all experience trauma on some level throughout our lives. Very few of us get through life without some bit of trauma, some more than others, right? There's different types of traumas that we might. But with the COVID-19 and the state of our world at the current moment, the violence that we're seeing, I bet that all of us are feeling a little on edge and tense. And if you're not, you're probably in the minority at the moment. So we're bringing all this tension and nervousness, and it turns in a lot of times to irritability and lack of patience, lack of ability to focus at work, or an inability to pay attention to the work that we're doing. It interrupts our relationships and makes it hard for us to relate to one another and truly connect with each other. And trauma can also make us sort of shut down and stop perceiving a lot of the things around us in the world because it's just too much. So we might, in the extreme version of this, actually go a little numb. So on the flip side of the anxiousness and the fear, your body might actually go into more of a freeze response where you're feeling very numb to everything. You're like, none of this is actually bothering me, or you're sort of missing big things that are happening and that aren't really having an emotional, that you're not really having an emotional reaction to. And that could be sort of like a blunted affect, we call that in the psychology world. So these are some of the different ways that your trauma can show up at work and how it can impact you. Anoop, I'd love to hear from you now.
Can I add one thing? Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
Before, I wanted to say that, in kind of looking back too, and I think it's an important point, like, I wasn't fully aware and conscious that I was manifesting my own anxiety, in the ways that I was doing it. And, I just wanted to bring that point up. It's not like I don't share that as like a way to get out, not blame myself, because I do, like, I was the way I led the way I led, but there is an unconsciousness to what was going on. And like
Yes.
a series of events led me to consciousness of what was going on. And maybe we'll get to that later, or maybe we don't. But sometimes people's behaviors aren't always conscious. Right?
Exactly.
There's a whole, probably a whole other webinar we can talk about that. But I just wanted to make that point.
No, that's very relevant because in my work with children, that's what I spend most of my time trying to help adults understand, is that your trauma responses are mostly unconscious. The behaviors that you're seeing are mostly unconscious. Nobody is thinking through like, oh, well, I feel scared, so I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, and I'm going to sabotage my life. It's a very unconscious thing that happens. It sort of happens under the radar, and it can look very intentional to people on the outside. But for the individual, lots of these emotional outbursts or controlling behaviors or avoiding behaviors or any of the sort of typical trauma responses that we see are very unconscious, and you will not realize, that you're doing it on purpose. And so that's a way to build some more compassion at work and in the workplace, is to recognize that these responses are not often intentional, and they are not usually even in the person's awareness. If, for example, they could be triggered by something, say a person is at work and the colleague next to them is wearing cologne of someone who previously had harmed them in some way. That right there could set their nervous system on high alert and into a trauma response. They have no conscious awareness of that, but suddenly they are feeling very dysregulated, angry or sad or scared, and acting in very protective and defensive ways. And they may not even realize that their nervous system is being triggered by the smell of the colleague next to them. So this is why it's important that we think through, we think deeper into the behaviors that we're seeing around us at work. I have someone in the chat that I just want to add. I won't say anybody's name, but I just to have some audience participation here. Let's see. I will try to summarize. Our workplace has changed so much with policies and procedures along with new administration. It has turned the workplace into a punitive environment. Is there any way to lessen the police state we are in? Well, great question. That's a frustration for lots of people, is that it does feel very harsh, right? It feels like a very harsh environment. And then some of the ways you have to do that is getting the buy-in from the leadership, right? The problem is that we have lots of leaders who also have trauma and it's unrecognized, unprocessed, and unhealed. And so they're playing out their trauma in their work environments. So we will get to that, but thank you for that question. I appreciate that. How about you, Anoop? Do you want to chime in?
So I'm gonna kind of jump into the world of medicine, the way we train, and in many ways, the way we learn medicine. Unfortunately, some of that goes right to the world of trauma itself because now we're inflicting the trauma by constantly, pimping, you could say, which is constant barrage of questions that we ask of trainees. So in medicine, we are technically trained to handle stressful situations, think clearly, and be productive. So working long hours, being able to stay calm in an environment that's very stressful, but at the price that we learn certain behaviors during that also, because our mentors, our other clinical leaders did it this way. In medicine, always the joke is, oh, we've always done it that way. Or sometimes corporate environments have it. So we pick up on that. But even now, most of you can remember COVID. What happened to the clinicians? This is not a trauma or stress that we were prepared for. We are used to seeing, patients expire, patients pass away, but so many young people, and for us that are in the world of wanting to do something, and that's why we're here, not being able to. And everyone went home every day with that, or if they went home that week. So that's the world that we kind of lived in. Now, imagine that person goes to a different role. They go to a different hospital, they go to a different job. They've experienced that. Everything that they experience or hear is now tainted by that.
Mm.
So it kind of, in many ways, reverberates for many. Sometimes we use stress as a way to help us memorize. I remember during my training, every morning we went through about 4 or 5 questions from a review course for about 45 minutes. The details we would go into the preparation, but the reason we prepared was because we didn't, when we were going to get picked on, we had to know the answer.
Mm.
If we didn't, we knew we were going to be embarrassed.
Mm.
That's a stressful environment where you
Yeah.
remember that, you'll
Right.
reverberate and it'll go through your mind over and over. So in many ways, that's occurring to all of us.
Oh, we lost your audio, Anoop.
Oh, can you hear me
Can
now?
you hear us?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay, you just cut out for a second.
Oh, so
It could be because I just got an alert that my internet connection is unstable, of course.
but that also
Oh,
occurs in
good.
corporate environments.
Oh, good. People are saying I can hear you. We can hear you, Anoop. Fantastic. We're getting lots of questions in the chat. I can't keep up with them all, but we will try to get to some of them. And if not, we may even have to do a follow-up call to answer some of these and kind of get into it more. This is pretty much an introduction today to this topic so that we can expand on it as we move forward. So we've talked a little bit about how we see, trauma showing up in the workplace. How are some of the ways, Mark, you shared some of the ways that you've created trauma in your workplace. What are some of the things that you have done to turn things around? Because that's also why we're here today, is to point out that yes, this does happen, and we are trying to cope with trauma while also working and also taking care of children and also, taking care of others. But we also have found some things that have helped our workplaces and have helped us heal. And we want to share some of that with you guys today too. So, Mark, I know you have a pretty strong success story from where you were to where you are today. So why don't you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I, I had already been dealing with a lot of trauma throughout life, and went through a divorce and adjusting to being a single father, and being CEO of a venture-backed company. Like, there's a whole lot of trauma there already. And then, or as I started to call, compounded trauma. I don't know if that's a real thing. That's what I call it for myself. And, and then COVID, and I was navigating a highly labor-intensive business, or attempting to navigate a highly intensive or labor-intensive business through COVID. And, it was a stressful and traumatizing experience for all of us. But I had, teammates dying, and, we had thousands of people across the United States going into grocery stores during COVID. Like, that was traumatizing on top of the trauma. And then, I had a very, very traumatic event when my best friend and business partner and his daughter died in a plane crash at the end of 2021. And at least for, my nervous system, it was game over. Like, that was the final straw. And I ended up in a, for lack of a better term, a trauma center outside of Nashville. And that's where I really learned what trauma-informed care was for the first time. Like, what is the root of all of this anxiety and depression and stuff that I've kind of lived with my whole life? And then, so it wasn't like I set out to be like, I'm a terrible leader, let me fix myself. I'd like to say that that's what it was, but it wasn't. It was a very traumatic final straw that broke the camel's back, that put me in a trauma center, that taught me a lot about why I was the way I was. It was that awareness thing for the first time at 46 or 47, however old I was at the time. Right. So I like lived a lifetime this way. And then, at 46, 47, I was like, oh, now it makes sense. So coming out of that with that level of awareness of what caused or what was causing it all, then I was like, well, it wasn't like I wasn't in pain, right? Like, all the anxiety and depression and all of that, suicidal thoughts throughout my life, like as far back as I can remember. Like, let me start working on this stuff with this new awareness of like what was the causes of those things. And then as I started to work more and more on myself, and it's a journey, it's constant, then my leadership style changed, right? Because like I now had a much better appreciation for the struggle that every human is experiencing, like the human condition, right? Like, you roll up, you meet somebody, and you see a face and eyes and mouth and nose and hair and arms, but like there's a whole ecosystem going on inside.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You've got the brain, you've got the chemicals, you've got the cellular movement of, like, there's just a whole lot going on inside. And like, I had no appreciation for the fact that that all existed. Like, I never was taught those things. A lot of us are not taught those things. Like, one of the things people hear me say all the time is like, hey, next time, like, when I'm born, could you give me the manual for this thing? Right? Like, that would have really been helpful. If there were some operating instructions for how to navigate this like crazy thing called the human body and human everything, right? It's kind of nuts. So like, armed with that awareness, then I just went deep, like, and continue to go deep on like how everything works. And then, it's ultimately led to like a real appreciation. And again, it's still a work in process of just like how hard it all is, and how many different emotions and memories and triggers, and like just all of it. And like, that's, manifesting now of, me feeling better. Like, I feel the best I've ever felt, which is part of it. And then, you know, that's manifested, you know, in a leadership capacity as well.
Can you give me some examples of how you lead differently now than you did in the past?
Yeah, I mean, oh my God, in the past, it was just like, you do what I say, because that's just, we got to get stuff done. You know, we don't have a lot of time to waste. We're venture back, we're growth. We got to grow at any cost. You know, burn yourself out, right? Like, you work 24/7, like, you do what you got to do. You have to report to investors, right? Like, and if it doesn't work, then I'll move on to the next person, right? Like,
Mm.
that was who I was, really. I mean, I annihilated people,
Mm.
right? Like, and like consciously wasn't really thinking about it. Like, I was doing what I thought the venture capitalists wanted me to do, and kind of almost to some degree like what I was taught. Like, it was one of the reasons why they invested in me, right? Like, this guy's a driver, he makes stuff happen. So like, let's give him some money and let him make some stuff happen, right? Like, so I thought I was doing what I was hired to do, right? And in a lot of cases, I probably was doing what I was hired to do. Never felt great. Like, didn't have the awareness as to why. Like, that's the unconscious episode that will maybe unleash sometime and get real Jungian for everyone. But you know, in terms of how I lead now, and it's still a work in process, and you know, some of my current co-leaders might be on the call. I mean, they've seen the evolution, like, literally real time, right? Like, um, you know, a lot, you know, working to listen more and, you know, be compassionate towards everybody's struggles and trauma and complexities of life and parenthood and grief and um, insecurities and fears and right, like, you know, that's, and it's a continued process because my nervous system's still like, is still adjusting, right? Like, um you know, it might come up later, but like, I'm grateful, and it's part of it. It's like, I'm grateful to be with an organization that is a healing organization, right? Like, everybody lives out loud at Lucero, right? Like, we bring our authentic selves every day and we live our struggle out loud. I mean, we're building a digital mental health company, hopefully to change the trajectory of some pretty nasty looking data around youth mental health. And luckily, we have a group of individuals who have all been through stuff, and you know, we're all unique and we all bring different experiences, and like, we all need rest in different ways, and we all need to recharge in different ways, and we all approach the world in different ways, and like, yet everybody on the team is like in full support and love and compassion of all of that. But like, that's been a work in process, you know, like, you know, the question earlier, like, how do you deal with this toxicity that some of these companies, um, you know, that's some of the work that this team is going to bring, hopefully, to, you know, corporations, is an awareness of, this is what you're doing to people, right? Like, this is how your actions affect other humans, and then not only how it affects other humans, but you're not getting the best out of your people, which is ultimately what you want, right? If you're traumatizing them even more than they're already traumatized, then you're not going to get the best of that person. So you're making things worse, right? So like, and when you live inside of a healing organization like I do now, you see that, right? Like, you start to achieve certain levels of flow state and creativity, and you know, magic happens at that point. But like, that's something we've lost because of short-termism and reporting to Wall Street and venture-backed groups who want, results tomorrow, and then people like me who are the ones who are supposed to do that, act like that, right? Like all of that, in my opinion, needs to be stripped down, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's the whole
So
conversation about, is it arson? Is the burnout that we're all experiencing in our workplaces, as Anoop so poignantly says, and maybe I should let him say it himself. Go ahead.
Well, in medicine, our old approach is always see one, do one, teach one, right? We live in that world. Because we've lived in the world of life and death, and we tend to be a bit more conservative. But as we transition to the corporate environment or administrative work, we forget that. We forget that there's other things out there where this is not going to lead to a death or something else. We still treat it that way. We still respond that way. In many ways, things that occur at work, as you shared earlier, and Mark did with the constant area of anxiety. So the way I was trained, we look at risk factors for heart disease and other things as chronic inflammation. So I used to always ask, does someone have rheumatoid arthritis? Do they have diabetes? Do they smoke? But now imagine all the silent inflammation that's constantly in our bodies for anxiety and stress and all the lovely hormones like cortisol that's just constantly cooking our bodies, the impact on that. So as Mark shared his style change, I found myself doing the same because he doesn't have to be my way. And in many ways, you've hired the right people, get out of their way, but that also implies that you have to be okay that they may not do it exactly the way you wanted it. And by allowing for what I call creativity, or in many ways, living within the guardrails of what's asked, they can come through with innovation. Otherwise, I found myself curtailing my team's abilities to be impactful by removing their ability to be creative, right? I remember an old adage from the hospital world where you'd have new folks come in with some brilliant ideas that worked elsewhere. But our attitude was always, oh, you like that? That's great. It was so good. Like that place was so good. Why don't you go back?
Hmm.
Imagine the mindset that we're setting for someone's brilliant new ideas.
Yeah.
We're not learning, we're actually curtailing it. We're,
Mm.
In many ways, um, avoiding the future that we want, which is creative. We want growth. We want people to stay, yet sometimes the culture we set is toxic. And
Yeah.
we, unfortunately, if we don't learn, we watch people leave. We watch people that had voices become silent. And in the corporate environment, it leads to the death spiral,
Right.
right? So to me, that's the way I've kind of pivoted my approach, and in many ways, done less. Support my associates, people, to allow them to be creative and let them think outside the box. So otherwise, we wind up with the old ideas and nothing moves.
Hmm. Yeah. We see that a lot, right? People get stuck in their ways. And it's not, and maybe that's a fear response too. When we're fearful, we're afraid to try new things.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely, especially in healthcare, right?
yeah.
It's not broken, don't fix it, right? That's
Hmm.
us. But that means we hold on to fax machines.
Oh, jeez.
That's us, right?
That's insane.
I mean, safety plays such a huge part, right? Like I think about like my current situation and my current team. Like, the most primal piece of the human is survival. Right? Like, it doesn't get any more primal than that. Right? It's like you've got survival and procreation is a form of survival, right? So like it boils down to survival. And back to the lion conversation, if you're in an environment and like, you've got lions around, and fine, they might not be real lions, but it feels like real lions, that's enough, right? Like if it feels like a real lion, it might as well be a real lion because the brain doesn't know the difference. Like, there's science behind that, right? And like if you work with a group of people, and like this is where this group hopefully, well, this group will be doing a lot of work. It's around creating safety area, like safe, and it's harder to find today because of just how things are set up. And they're like, listen, there's things in life that you can't control, right? Like layoffs are going to happen, things are going to happen, right? Like, but leading up to those things, just living out loud, being honest, being transparent, being like, honesty is a huge piece of it. Like being collaborative, right? Being respectful of people's differences and patterns and biorhythms, and like, all of those things factor into what can help contribute to a healing organization. And we've moved so far away from that. So it's like bringing those things, with safety being at the front end, because like that's what drives all of this stuff. If we're, like we're scared, like there's reason to be a lot of time, like,
Right.
and then, you have that conversation. We have that conversation with Sarah all the time. Like, I'm not sure we're going to be here 6 months from now, right? Like, why? Because we're a startup, right? And like, guess what? That's scary. And like, it's okay to be scared about that. Like, of course you'll be scared about that. Like, why wouldn't you be scared about that? Right. So like having those conversations out loud in every form, right? Like, what are all your fears? We're like, just live out loud and not have any repercussions of that. When like a lot of times we grow up and like there's repercussions for everything, starting from childhood, right? And like all of a sudden at the age of 50, I roll into an organization. It's like, I don't have to be afraid to be Mark, right? Like that's powerful. Like that's healing on so many levels, right? And like that's the work that we can do with companies to like really understand that when you do that, the magic happens. To Anoop's point, creativity and flow is where the magic happens. There's science there too, right? And that's what you want, right? You want innovation, you want creativity, you want. Now some organizations are just like, they don't, right? And you know what? I'm hoping that with the work that we're going to do, there's going to be organizations that are healing centers, and they're going to be organizations that aren't. And the people, who want to go to healing centers will go to those companies, and the ones that don't. And, my hope is that the ones that aren't healing centers die, right? Like, I'm just being honest, right? Like, if you're not helping, then you're harming the ecosystem. Go away, right? Like, I would love for corporations to be healing centers, and if they're not, then they go away, right? Like, that's my hope in some of this work.
Well said. Thank you. So I'm going to jump in with a couple of just concrete things that people can do at work, because it seems like from the questions I'm getting, and I'm just kind of riffing here, but from the questions I'm seeing in my chat, we seem to have some people who are recognizing that trauma is happening at work, either through, vicarious trauma, which is trauma that's passed to us in relation to people who are experiencing trauma. So for example, in a medical setting, if you are caring for someone who has had some sort of traumatic injury, then you can actually start to manifest symptoms of trauma just because of your relation to those people. And that happens a lot in my line of work as a psychotherapist and a trauma expert, or anyone who does social work or works with children in schools. Anybody you have a close proximity to that has experienced significant trauma, you can actually, our nervous systems will link up. And you will actually begin to experience some of the same symptoms of that person's trauma. And if you aren't aware of that, it can be very disorienting to the point where you feel like you're going crazy because you don't understand why you're having all these emotional feelings and anxiety, or maybe you're shutting down and freezing, and you don't know why, because, you think, well, I haven't been through anything. Well, maybe look around at the people around you. Maybe it's something they are going through that your nervous system has now picked up and began to manifest within your own body. So I always encourage people who work in the helping fields to recognize this type of vicarious trauma that can take place. It's also known as secondary trauma. And part of the biggest thing that helps with that is first knowing what it is, and then also having the skills and the tools to help yourself regulate your nervous system when you feel as though you're becoming overwhelmed. And then we also have some people in the chat asking questions, like they realize that they are experiencing challenges and trauma at work, but their leadership does not. And so not having leadership involved, like, what do we do then? How do we change a system that we're part of, but we don't have any power over? And some of the ways we can do that is with what's called culture carriers or ambassadors, finding people within your organization who get it. And they may not be management, they may not be your supervisor, they may not be the owner of the company, but finding others and kind of linking up with them to, kind of create your own little grassroots movement within the organization to say, hey, you and I, and let's get a couple of the other people together to try and create some influence here in our company, because that's kind of where it starts, right? We can make change, but we have to connect with each other, and we have to find other like-minded people who are interested in making a change. Because most of the change starts from the frontline staff and the middle management within an organization. And so finding who those influencers are, and there's always influencers, is key to creating some systems change in your work environment. And then, there's lots of other things and movements that we could kind of start around self-care, and, really not the fancy foo-foo kind of self-care, but, the kind that involves really getting to know ourselves better and finding out what helps to calm us down from our trauma reactions. And I wanted Anoop to maybe speak a little bit more too about how trauma does impact your nervous system and some of the things that you can do to help settle it if you have some ideas.
Sure. I'm going to go into more the mechanism, or where our flight or fight system really was set up for. It's meant to be for a very short-term hit. As Mark said, the lion's trying to eat us. But that lion's not going to try to eat you for 24 days or 24 hours, 7 days a week, or years. Yet, when our bodies are constantly stressed, that's what it feels like. So, we'll see how many raise your hand on this one, but we'll do the survey. But how many of you feel that you're in a chronic state of stress? So when you're like that, you've got elevated cortisol. It'll downregulate your immune system. So that's why we use steroids for, autoimmune disease, others diseases also. It impacts your sleep, causes you to, gain weight sometimes because we're eating more. Our muscles feel tight. You feel our heart's racing. Impacts our blood pressure. Stress hormones will actually go right through your blood vessels and change how they are. Things that you can do. One, recognize that this is where you are. Can you avoid that trigger or that stress? As Beth mentioned, the other champions that can help guide you through this. We began this talk with breathing exercises. And there are multiple different ways that are impactful for each one of us because we're all slightly different. I just call it the best way to melt our brains, right? To really release. Sometimes the way I look at it is, intrinsically we are happy. Life loads us up. How do we offload that every day? And that's what we need to do. When I was practicing as a family doc, my analogy was always after dinner, I want you, the wife, the kids, the dog, cat, pet iguana, whatever you have, go for a walk for about an hour. Leave the beeper cell phone at home. That's how I am. But the purpose of that was so we talk again, talk about our day over time, get the physical exercise. But the biggest value was speaking to each other to release the day's burden. We just don't do that anymore. We're more and more isolated with technology, but also with ourselves. And getting back to the human connection, that's the win. When it comes at work, and everyone mentioned that leaders don't recognize it, but leaders do when they see turnover, what they do when they have healthcare costs. Those are related. How do we impact that? That's a great opportunity for this work. Hopefully I answered the question for the person that chimed in.
Oops, I muted myself because I was coughing. Thank you for that answer. I'm going to go over to the chat now and kind of see if I can ask you guys a few more questions to weigh in before the end because we're about to wrap up. Let's see. So here's a good one. How do you respond, or what is the response to someone who you know is affected by workplace trauma? So for me, like, I assume that everybody has had a trauma, right? Because you can't see trauma, it's invisible. So it has to become sort of a mindset shift, a perspective shift on your worldview and of people around you, to recognize that I don't know who has trauma and who doesn't. So I have to behave in a way as almost as though everybody does. And for some people that feels really uncomfortable, but really I just call it being a good human. I teach a lot about trauma-informed caregiving and trauma-informed parenting, and really it could be just called emotionally healthy parenting because all the skills that are involved in trauma-informed care and in trauma-informed relationships are really just best practices for creating safety, trust, connection, vulnerability, on authenticity. And so sometimes we have to go first. We have to be the first ones, especially if you're a leader or if you are going through something. You have to, if you want to see change take place, you have to go first and share a little bit about your own stuff to somebody that you trust, and see if then they can reciprocate that back in going into some of their stuff. And that helps to build that trust when you go first. And as leaders, it's your job, right, to go first. And so when we work with people who are in leadership roles, that's really the important part of this, is that we can't wait for our staff or the employees to come to us and be vulnerable. We have to be vulnerable ourselves first and be willing to share some of our own darkness with the team so that then they can feel comfortable bringing their stuff to us, because we know they are experiencing trauma and we know they are struggling and we know it's hurting the company's bottom line, but nobody's talking about any of it. Everyone's too afraid. Everyone's too scared. So I encourage any leaders on this call to do exactly what Anoop and Mark are doing here today. And thank you so much for being role models and examples of leaders who are willing to stand up and say, yes, I recognize that this trauma is happening, and this is what I think needs to be done to start to shift things. And I know this was a short call today. We're already a minute over, so I don't want to hold people up, but I do just want to encourage those here today to continue to stay in touch with us. We want to expand on this conversation, and we're throwing around some ideas of maybe starting a podcast with expert guests who come on to try and solve some of this invisible trauma that's floating around in all of our organizations, that's harming all of us as well as our growth. So thank you for everyone who made time to be here today. I will follow up with your questions, and you will be getting a follow-up email from us with some additional information, some resources because you registered for the event, you will definitely, we have your email and we'll be able to reach back out to you for future events that we might host and any upcoming announcements and how we want to continue building this community, right? Because we need each other in order to impact these big mammoth size organizations. And so I'm hoping that the people on the call today, this is just the first step in a relationship that we're all building, a community, a movement that we're building together so that we can begin to impact our workplaces instead of just one person at a time. You know, a group is always going to be a bigger impact. So thank you all for being here. I see some people that were here from Scotland and Ireland and all across the world today. So thank you so much. And I'm seeing lots of nice comments that some people would love to be a guest if we do a podcast, and yes to the podcast. And thank you, thank you, thank you. I see so many people saying thank you. This was wonderful, and we're really glad that you spent this hour with us here today. Stay tuned for more from me, Mark, and Anoop on trauma-informed workplaces. You'll be seeing something in your email soon. Thank you guys for being here today. Please try to fill out the survey if you can. Please, please, please remember one thing to fill out the survey. Thank you all, and we'll be in touch soon. Have a great rest of your day.